It was supposed to be a routine shift. After 10 grueling hours of responding to everything from minor scrapes to full-blown emergencies, I finally had a few minutes to breathe. I pulled into my apartment complex's parking lot, slid into my designated space. Yes, designated, and locked the doors. My plan was simple: a 10-minute break, a quick bite from the diner across the street, and then back on duty. I checked my radio before heading inside. The thing had barely been silent all day, but at that moment, it was just static. Bliss. I grabbed my bag, stretching my sore back as I walked across the lot. Working as a paramedic meant never really knowing what the next hour would bring. It could be a quiet ride, or it could be chaos. Either way, I needed coffee. Just as I reached the sidewalk, my radio crackled. A call came through. Chest pains, unstable vitals. My partner, Ethan, was already en route. He needed backup, and he needed it now. Adrenaline surged through me. I spun on my heel and ran straight back to my car, but something was off. My car wasn't sitting the way I left it. That's when I saw them. A police cruiser, a tow truck, and of course, the smug, self-important figure of Mr. Richard Langley, the HOA board president. I had dealt with Richard before, and it was never pleasant. If you asked him, the neighborhood was his kingdom, and we were merely tenants in his grand vision of suburban perfection. Unfortunately for me, his vision didn't include a paramedic's car parked in a legally assigned space. I skidded to a stop as the tow truck driver hooked his chains under my front bumper. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted. The cop turned. The tow truck guy barely glanced up, but Richard, he grinned like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Mr. Carter," he said, clasping his hands together, "we've given you multiple notices about your vehicle. It's in violation of HOA standards." I blinked. "What?" The cop cleared his throat. "Sir, your vehicle has been reported as improperly parked." I pointed at my spot. "It's literally assigned to me. I pay for it." Richard shook his head. "Well, technically, we've reclassified that space. It's now a reserved guest parking area." I almost laughed. Almost. But then my radio crackled again, and Ethan's voice cut through the air. "I need you here now. He's going downhill fast." I turned back to the officers, hoping, praying that someone had some common sense. "I am responding to a medical emergency. I am on duty. If you tow my car, you are delaying emergency medical care." The officer hesitated. The tow truck driver didn't. He tightened the chains. Richard crossed his arms, clearly enjoying himself. Rules are rules. I clenched my fists. "You are really going to make me stand here and argue while someone is having a medical emergency?" The officer shifted. "Look, sir, I understand." "No, you don't," I snapped. "My partner is on scene with a patient who might die if I don't get there. Do you want that on your conscience?" Silence. Even the tow truck guy hesitated for a second. Richard scoffed. "Oh, please. You paramedics exaggerate everything. I saw the last call you went on. You helped some teenager who twisted his ankle. That was it." I reached for my radio and clicked it to speaker mode. Ethan's voice blared through, frantic and urgent. "I've got an unresponsive male. Breathing shallow, BP's dropping fast. I need backup now." The officer paled. The tow truck guy actually took a step back. Richard's smirk finally wavered. "This is real," I said, staring at the cop. "You know I have to go." The cop exhaled sharply. He turned to Richard. "Look, maybe this isn't the best time." But Richard wasn't giving up that easily. If we bend the rules for him, we have to do it for everyone. I was about to lose it. "Richard, I swear." But then the tow truck driver, of all people, spoke up. I don't really want to be on the news for towing an ambulance guy's car during a medical emergency." Richard turned on him. "You were fine with it a minute ago." "Yeah, well," the guy scratched his head. "I hadn't thought about it yet." The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. Finally, he looked at me. "Go. Just go." I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped into my car and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving Richard fuming in my rearview mirror. I should have been focused entirely on the emergency ahead, but one thought lingered in my mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The ridiculousness of what had just happened barely had time to sink in. Right now, my focus was on the road and the dying man waiting for me at the other end of it. Traffic was heavier than I wanted. Every red light felt like it was deliberately slowing me down. My siren wasn't on. I was driving my personal vehicle, but I laid on the horn whenever necessary, weaving through cars with as much precision as I could without becoming the next emergency myself. The whole time, Ethan's voice kept cutting in over the radio. Still no response. Weak pulse. BP's tanking. My gut tightened. I ran another light, barely missing a confused-looking minivan driver. The hospital was too far. If we didn't stabilize him on site, it wouldn't matter how fast the ambulance got him there. Finally, I turned onto the street. I spotted the flashing lights of our ambulance, and Ethan crouched next to a man lying motionless on the ground. A woman, presumably the man's wife, hovered nearby, crying into her hands. I threw the car into park and jumped out. Ethan barely looked up. Took you long enough. You want to hear about the worst HOA president on the planet, or should we save a life first? I dropped to my knees beside him. What's the status? Ethan pressed down on the man's sternum, counting out compressions. Heart rate's erratic. He had crushing chest pain before he went out. I yanked open the medical kit, grabbing the defibrillator pads. We shocking. Damn right we're shocking. I slapped the pads onto the man's chest. Ethan moved back as I grabbed the defibrillator and adjusted the charge. Clear. The man's body jerked slightly as the shock hit him. We both stared at the monitor. Still no rhythm. Ethan swore under his breath. Hit him again. I recharged the defibrillator. Another jolt. Another silence. Then, beep. Ethan exhaled sharply. We got something. It wasn't a perfect rhythm, but it was a heartbeat. A weak one, barely hanging on, but enough for now. The man's wife dropped to her knees beside him. Oh my God. Oh my God. Is he going to be okay? We need to get him to the hospital right now, Ethan said. The ambulance crew had the stretcher ready, and we loaded him up fast. I rode with them to the hospital, watching as he started to stabilize. The wife sat beside me, holding her husband's limp hand. By the time we reached the ER, the worst of the crisis had passed. We handed him off to the doctors, who took over like a well-oiled machine. The wife clung to my arm before I left. Thank you, she whispered, tears still running down her face. I just nodded, too exhausted to say much. But as I stepped out into the hospital corridor, I felt something else creeping in. Anger. Not at the man, not at his condition. Those were things we dealt with all the time, but at the absolute stupidity of what had delayed me. This man almost died because of an HOA rule. Ethan, now leaning against a vending machine, gave me a look. What's that face for? I crossed my arms. You ever take down a power-hungry HOA president before? He raised an eyebrow. Not yet. I exhaled. I think I'm about to. Ethan smirked. You know I'm in. We left the hospital, but I had already made up my mind. Richard Langley wanted to play dirty? Fine. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I barely slept that night. The exhaustion from the shift should have knocked me out the second my head hit the pillow, but I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. The delay, the desperate race to the scene, the way that man's life had hung by a thread because of a parking violation. It made me sick and furious. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't just angry, I was motivated. I grabbed my laptop and a cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started digging. Richard Langley had run our HOA like a personal fiefdom for years, and no one had ever challenged him. At least, not successfully. He was the type who thrived on making people miserable over the tiniest infractions. Trash bins left out a minute too long. Violation notice. Grass not perfectly trimmed. Fine. Porch decorations not in approved colors. Warning letter. But I had something bigger. I had a story. A paramedic delayed on an emergency call because an HOA president insisted on towing his car when it was parked in his own assigned spot. That wasn't just annoying, that was newsworthy. I made a few calls. A buddy of mine, Chris, worked for a local news station. He listened, whistled low, and said, "Yeah, that's the kind of thing people eat up. You willing to go on record?" Absolutely. By noon, the first article had gone online. Within hours, the local news was running the story. The headline, HOA attempts to tow paramedic's car during life-or-death emergency. It spread fast. Neighbors started talking. People who had been putting up with Richard's nonsense for years suddenly had receipts. Turns out, my case was just the tip of the iceberg. There were reports of misused HOA funds, shady fines issued without board approval, and the best one, an illegally signed contract with a towing company that just so happened to be owned by Richard's cousin. The more people talked, the worse it got for Richard. By the end of the week, there was a petition for his removal. By the next HOA meeting, the room was packed. I made sure to sit front and center, arms crossed, watching as Richard's face turned redder by the second. He tried to defend himself, blabbering about enforcing community standards and necessary actions to uphold property values. No one was buying it. One older resident stood up and waved her phone. I read that article, Richard. You nearly got someone killed over a parking space. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Someone else chimed in. And what's this about towing contracts? You've been using HOA money to line your own pockets. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's completely unfounded. Actually, a man in a suit stood up from the back, holding a thick folder. It's very much founded. I'm an attorney, and I'd love to discuss these financial discrepancies in greater detail. The entire room went dead silent. Richard paled. He stammered something about how he had always acted in the best interests of the community, but no one was listening anymore. His fate was sealed. The vote was unanimous. Richard Langley was removed from his position, effective immediately. By the time I left the meeting, I felt lighter. Not just because I'd won, but because, for the first time in years, people weren't afraid to push back. A week later, I pulled into my parking spot, my actual, legal parking spot, and saw something new, a note taped to the parking sign. It read, "Thank you for standing up to him. Your neighbors." I smiled, crumpled it into my pocket, and headed inside. No fines, no warnings, just a well-earned victory. Things in the neighborhood felt different after that. People weren't walking on eggshells anymore. Before, no one dared step out of line, afraid of receiving a violation letter or a surprise fine. But after Richard got the boot, it was like the whole complex woke up. A few weeks later, a new HOA board was elected, one made up of people who actually cared about the residents instead of just controlling them. They reviewed old rules, canceled unfair fines, and, best of all, got rid of that ridiculous towing contract. My parking spot was never an issue again. Neighbors started chatting more, too. People who used to avoid eye contact at the mailbox suddenly wanted to talk. They shared stories about their own run-ins with Richard, about how they had felt powerless to stop him, until now. Turns out, my situation had just been the spark. One older gentleman, Mr. Taylor, shook my hand in the parking lot one morning. I haven't been able to leave my trash can out for 10 minutes without getting a notice for the last 5 years, he grumbled. Then he grinned. Feels good to see things change. I didn't expect much more beyond that. I had done my part. The neighborhood was in better hands, and Richard was gone. That was enough for me. But then, a few weeks later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It wasn't a fine or a warning. It was a thank you. Inside was a note, handwritten in slightly shaky cursive. Dear Mr. Carter, you don't know me, but you saved my husband's life that night. I've been wanting to reach out, but I didn't know what to say. Every day I get to spend with him now is because of you. Thank you for what you do, not just for us, but for everyone you help. I know what happened with the HOA that night, and I just want you to know that there are people in this community who appreciate you more than words can say. Enclosed was a small check, nothing extravagant, but enough to make my eyebrows raise. Underneath it, a note from several other neighbors, all signed, saying it was a donation to the local paramedics fund. I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at it for a long time. The truth was, I hadn't done any of this for thanks. I hadn't done it to be a hero. I had done it because I was just so damn mad that the rules had nearly cost a man his life. But knowing that it had meant something to people, that was unexpected. I deposited the donation straight into the paramedics fund the next morning. Then I went to work, another shift full of unpredictable chaos. And as I climbed into my car at the end of the day, parked safely in my spot, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smirk. Lesson learned: never underestimate a pissed-off paramedic. Epilogue. The neighborhood continued to thrive in the months that followed. The new HOA board implemented several changes that made life easier for everyone. They even started a community fund to support local first responders, inspired by the donation I had received. As for Richard Langley, he disappeared from the neighborhood shortly after his removal. Rumor had it he moved to a different state, but no one really cared to find out. The community had moved on, and so had I. But every now and then, as I pulled into my parking spot after a long shift, I'd think about that night. The night I almost lost a patient because of a petty rule. And I'd remind myself that sometimes standing up for what's right is the most important call of all. Title: The Paramedics Stand, Part 2, The Aftermath. The days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood continued to flourish under the new HOA board. The oppressive atmosphere that Richard Langley had cultivated was gone, replaced by a sense of community and cooperation. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other out, and the constant fear of fines and violations had vanished. It felt like a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. But for me, life didn't slow down. As a paramedic, my shifts were still long, unpredictable, and often chaotic. The adrenaline rushes, the life-and-death decisions, the moments of triumph and heartbreak, they were all part of the job. And while I had won a significant battle against Richard, I knew that my real fight was still out there, on the streets, in the back of an ambulance, and in the emergency rooms where lives hung in the balance. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, I returned home to find an envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't a thank you note this time. It was a letter from Richard Langley. I hesitated before opening it. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash, to forget about the man who had caused so much unnecessary stress and pain. But curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Dear Mr. Carter, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I don't blame you. I've had a lot of time to think since everything happened, and I realize now that I was wrong. My actions were selfish, and I let my desire for control cloud my judgment. I nearly cost a man his life because of my stubbornness, and for that, I am truly sorry. I'm writing this letter not to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but to let you know that I've decided to make some changes in my life. I've moved to a new town, and I'm trying to start over. I've joined a community outreach program, and I'm working to be a better person. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I hope that by doing better, I can make amends in some small way. I also want to thank you. You stood up to me when no one else would, and you showed me that my actions had real consequences. You made me see that I was part of the problem, and for that, I am grateful. Sincerely, Richard Langley. I stared at the letter for a long time, unsure of how to feel. Richard's words seemed genuine, but part of me still harbored resentment. The memory of that night, the panic, the frustration, the fear that I might be too late to save a life, was still fresh in my mind. But as I read the letter again, I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't going to help anyone, least of all me. I folded the letter and tucked it away, deciding to let it go. Richard was trying to change, and maybe that was enough. A few weeks later, I received another surprise. This time, it was a phone call from the local news station. Chris, my buddy who had helped break the story about Richard, was on the line. Hey, Carter, he said, his voice brimming with excitement. We're doing a follow-up piece on the HOA situation, and we want to interview you. People are still talking about what happened, and they want to know how things have changed since Richard was removed. I hesitated. I wasn't exactly comfortable with the idea of being in the spotlight, but I also knew that sharing the story could inspire others to stand up against injustice. All right, I said finally. I'll do it. The interview was scheduled for the following week. When the day arrived, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, with Chris asking me questions about the incident and its aftermath. I talked about the challenges of being a paramedic, the importance of community, and the need to hold people in power accountable. I also mentioned Richard's letter, emphasizing that change was possible, even for those who had made mistakes. The segment aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. People reached out to thank me for sharing my story, and many shared their own experiences with oppressive HOAs or other forms of bureaucratic overreach. It felt like the conversation was just beginning, and I was proud to be a part of it. But life as a paramedic doesn't stop for interviews or community activism. A few days after the segment aired, I was back on duty, responding to calls and doing my best to save lives. One call, in particular, stood out. It was late at night, and we were dispatched to a car accident on the highway. When we arrived, the scene was chaotic. 2 cars had collided, and one of them was overturned. The driver was trapped inside, unconscious and bleeding heavily. Ethan and I worked quickly, stabilizing the driver and extricating him from the wreckage. As we loaded him into the ambulance, I noticed something familiar about him. It wasn't until we reached the hospital that I realized who he was, Richard Langley. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once delayed me during a life-or-death emergency was now the one whose life hung in the balance. I pushed the thought aside and focused on doing my job. Richard survived the accident, but his injuries were severe. He spent weeks in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries and physical therapy. During that time, I visited him a few times, not out of obligation, but because I felt it was the right thing to do. The first time I walked into his hospital room, he looked surprised to see me. "Carter," he said weakly, "I didn't expect you to come." "I'm not here as a paramedic," I said, pulling up a chair. "I'm here as someone who believes in second chances." We talked for a while, about the accident, about his recovery, and about the changes he was trying to make in his life. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. By the end of it, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. As the months passed, life in the neighborhood continued to improve. The new HOA board implemented even more changes, including a community garden and a neighborhood watch program. People were happier, more connected, and more willing to look out for each other. And as for me, I kept doing what I do best, saving lives, one call at a time. The experience with Richard had taught me a lot, about standing up for what's right, about the power of community, and about the importance of forgiveness. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. One evening, as I pulled into my parking spot after another long shift, I noticed something new. A small plaque had been installed next to the sign that marked my spot. It read, "Reserved for Paramedic Carter, a hero in our community." I smiled, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude. The neighborhood had come a long way, and so had I. And as I headed inside, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. Title: The Paramedic Stand, Part 3, A New Beginning. The plaque next to my parking spot became a symbol of the neighborhood's gratitude, but it also served as a reminder of the responsibility I carried. Every time I saw it, I was reminded of the night that had changed everything. The night I had stood up to Richard Langley and, in doing so, had sparked a movement that transformed our community. But life as a paramedic doesn't allow for much reflection. There's always another call, another emergency, another life to save. One particularly busy shift, Ethan and I were dispatched to a multi-car pileup on the interstate. The scene was chaos. Cars crumpled like paper, smoke rising from one of the vehicles, and people screaming for help. We worked quickly, triaging the injured and stabilizing those in critical condition. Among the victims was a young girl, no more than 8 years old, trapped in the back seat of a car that had been T-boned by a speeding truck. Her name was Lily. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, and her pulse weak. Ethan and I worked together to extricate her from the wreckage, carefully stabilizing her neck and spine as we moved her onto a stretcher. The entire time, her mother stood nearby, sobbing and pleading with us to save her daughter. We rushed Lily to the hospital, sirens blaring and lights flashing. The doctors took over as soon as we arrived, and Ethan and I stood in the hallway, catching our breath. It was moments like these that reminded me why I had chosen this career, the chance to make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Lily survived, but her recovery would be long and difficult. Her mother, a woman named Sarah, reached out to me a few days later to thank me for saving her daughter's life. She invited me to their home for dinner, and though I was hesitant at first, I eventually agreed. The dinner was a humbling experience. Sarah and her husband, Mark, were incredibly grateful, but they also shared their fears and struggles. Lily had a long road ahead of her, with months of physical therapy and emotional healing. As I listened to their story, I realized that my role as a paramedic didn't end when the patient left my care. Sometimes, the aftermath of a traumatic event was just as challenging as the event itself. A few weeks later, I received another unexpected letter. This one was from Richard Langley. He had been following my story in the news and wanted to meet in person. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in town. When I arrived, Richard was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked different, thinner, more subdued, but also more at peace. He stood as I approached, extending his hand. "Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for coming." I shook his hand and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, about what happened, about the choices I made, and about the person I want to be. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make amends. I nodded, letting him continue. I've started volunteering at a local shelter, he said, helping people who are struggling, people who have been pushed to the margins of society. It's been eye-opening. I realize now that I spent so much time trying to control others because I was afraid of losing control myself. But I see now that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. I was surprised by his words. The Richard I had known was arrogant and self-serving, but the man sitting across from me seemed genuinely changed. I also wanted to thank you, he said, not just for saving my life after the accident, but for showing me that it's never too late to change. You stood up to me when no one else would, and you made me see the harm I was causing. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for what I did, but I'm going to try. I didn't know what to say. Richard's transformation was unexpected, but it was also inspiring. It reminded me that people are capable of change, even when it seems impossible. As the months passed, I found myself becoming more involved in the community. I started volunteering at the local shelter with Richard, helping to serve meals and provide medical care to those in need. It was a different kind of work than what I was used to, but it was just as rewarding. I also began mentoring a group of young paramedics, sharing my experiences and teaching them the skills they would need to succeed in the field. It was my way of giving back, of ensuring that the next generation of first responders would be ready to face whatever challenges came their way. One evening, as I was leaving the shelter, I ran into Sarah and Lily. Lily was walking with the help of a cane, but her smile was as bright as ever. She ran up to me and hugged me tightly. "Thank you for saving me," she said. I knelt down to her level. "You're a fighter, Lily. You saved yourself. I just gave you a little help." Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. "You've done so much for us, Carter. We'll never forget it." As I watched them walk away, I felt a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was why I had become a paramedic, not for the recognition or the accolades, but for the chance to make a difference in people's lives. The neighborhood continued to thrive, and the sense of community grew stronger with each passing day. The new HOA board implemented even more changes, including a scholarship fund for local students and a program to support small businesses in the area. It was a far cry from the oppressive regime of Richard Langley, and it was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a common cause. As for me, I kept doing what I do best, saving lives, one call at a time. But I also found a new sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the impact I could have on the world around me. The plaque next to my parking spot was a reminder of where I had been, but it was also a symbol of where I was going. One evening, as I pulled into my spot after another long shift, I noticed something new. A group of neighbors had gathered nearby, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Carter, and our hero." They cheered as I stepped out of my car, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I didn't do this for the recognition, but in that moment, I realized how much it meant to be appreciated. These people, my neighbors, my community, were the reason I kept going, even on the hardest days. As I waved to the crowd and headed inside, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been worth it. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.